Life is too short to have a frustrating internet experience. If you're currently in this boat, it might be because you have to replace your router. In this episode from Network from Home, I'm going to be covering a few different scenarios where you need to think about replacing your router. So let's dive right into it. So what are some indicators that you need to replace your router? Well, one of the most important ones is if the performance of your router is degrading over time. What I mean is if your router is losing its internet connection, it feels like over time your internet connection has gotten slower or laggier, or if your router overheats and turns off and has to cool down before it can get turned back on. These are all indicators that you may need to replace your router. An important thing to note here is we're talking about performance over time. So essentially, if everything was working great with your router and over time you've noticed these symptoms, it could be an indicator you have to replace your router. If you've always had poor internet performance with your router, well, that could be due to a number of factors. Maybe you have the wrong internet plan for your home network. Maybe you bought the wrong router for your home network. There are a whole host of reasons why that might be the case, and that's a totally separate problem from what we're talking about in this video. But if your internet performance has been degrading over time, there are a few things you can try to do to fix the issue before you run out and replace your router. Namely, some important things you can do. You can take your router, you can reboot it. In other words, you can power it down, wait 30 seconds, and then power it back on. And while you're at it, you can do the same thing for your modem as well. Maybe your modem is having problems and that's why you're seeing poor internet performance over time. Another thing you should do is look at the status lights of both your router and your modem. If everything is green and everything looks good, you can move on to the next step. But if you're seeing some status lights that look abnormal, maybe they're orange or they're red, those will give you some indications that there might be some other issues with your connection that you need to address. Another thing you should do while you're looking at your modem and router is you should be inspecting all of the Ethernet cables you have in your home network. For example, if you're connecting your modem and router with an Ethernet cable, or your devices and your router with an Ethernet cable, you want to take a look at all of those, make sure they're not damaged or bent. You just want to make sure that everything looks okay and that those cables are functioning properly. If you've done those 3 steps and everything looks good, the next thing you can look at is seeing if there are any available firmware upgrades for your router itself. As a refresher, firmware is the actual code that exists on your router itself, and that's what tells the router how to function properly. So sometimes manufacturers will put out firmware upgrades which cause the router to run better and it might improve your internet performance. To do that, I'm going to walk you through the steps of checking to see if there are firmware upgrades for my Archer A7 router. I know this is an outdated router that needs to be replaced, so it's a perfect example for what I'm going to show you in this video. Okay, so here we are on my laptop. What I need to do is I need to access my router settings to see if there's an upgrade available for the firmware. What you first need to do, you want to make sure you're connected to the Wi-Fi network of the router whose settings you want to access. So Network from Home 5G, that's good to go. Now let's open an internet browser. From here, what you need to do is put in the IP address of your router, which for me is 192.168.0.1. Now I want to enter the password for my router settings, and this will take me to my settings homepage. I ran through these steps pretty quickly, so if you have any trouble accessing your router settings, I've detailed all of that as well as some troubleshooting you can do in a previous video, so you want to check that out before moving forward here. Here we are in my router settings, and I know right away, just because I've had this router for a long time, that they usually have a notification in the top right telling you if you have firmware upgrades available. But what you can do is you can also check for updates manually. So let's go ahead and follow those steps so you can follow along. Another note here is if you have a different make and model of router, the steps here to see if your router has firmware upgrades will likely be the same, even though it might look a little bit different from my TP-Link Archer A7 router. So to manually check for firmware upgrades, we go to Advanced. From here, we go to System Tools, scroll down, and then Firmware Upgrade. And here it is right here, check for upgrades. So we're going to select that. And unsurprisingly, it says your firmware is up to date. As I mentioned, I know there are no upgrades for my router's firmware, so this is an expected result. If there are currently no firmware upgrades available for your router, What you want to do is you'll want to put your detective hat on and see when the last firmware upgrades were available for your router. So in my case here, it says latest version of firmware. And here, this is pretty telling. This is 2022 7/14. So July 14th of 2022 is the last firmware upgrade that was available for my Archer A7 router. Now this should be a little bit concerning because as of the time of this video, that's about 3 years ago. So what we want to do is we want to check to see if this router is end of support. What might be happening here is the manufacturer may no longer be supporting this router. And if this is the case, this means they're no longer providing firmware upgrades for the device. Now, of course, this is an issue, and this is for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, if they're not issuing firmware upgrades, it means they're not changing how your router performs. Any of that code that's on your router is going to be staying the same, so the performance of the router is going to be staying the same. Additionally, with these firmware upgrades, there are usually security patches that are included with them. So if a vulnerability is found with your router, what will normally happen when your router is within support and being supported by the manufacturer, they will issue a firmware update so that way that security vulnerability gets patched and you don't have anything to worry about. But if a router becomes end of support, what happens is if there's a security vulnerability that's found for the router, your manufacturer doesn't go and issue an update for it. So essentially, your router is then left out to dry. It has security vulnerabilities that are not patched, and ultimately that puts you and your home network at risk. If there's any consolation here, it's that there are actual references that exist that will tell you if your router is end of support. And if your router is end of support, you really want to think about replacing it sometime soon. So how do you find out if your router is end of support? Let's take a closer look. First, we're going to log out of my router settings. So we're going to log out here. Yes. Now you just want to perform a simple Google search for your manufacturer and then say end of life or end of support. So what I'm going to do, I have a TP-Link router, so I'm going to do TP-Link router end of support. Here the first result is the TP-Link end of life products, so let's click that. Here it asks us if we're from the United States, and the reason for this is that depending upon where you live and where you purchase the device, it will have different end of life and end of support dates. For me, I'm in the United States, I'll click go. Here we want to scroll down, and what we're looking for is the end of life list for home networking equipment. This part up here is important as well. It's basically detailing that you need to understand the make, the model, and version of your router. If you're not sure what this information is, this will all be detailed on the informational sticker on the device. I'll provide a screenshot of what it looks like on the bottom of my router so you can see what it looks like, because that will be very helpful when we open up this end of life and end of support list. So let's do that now. Okay, and here what you have for TP-Link is a list of all of their home networking products, and it also gives you the end of service notification date and then the end of service date. That end of service date is really important because that's the date that they stop supporting your router. In other words, they'll stop putting out firmware updates after that date. So in looking at my router, I have an Archer A7 router, and the hardware is version 5, as indicated in that screenshot that I previously showed you. So that's what we need to find in this list. So let's run a search. Archer A7. Okay, and here we go. Here's Archer A7, so that's the router I have. Here's hardware version 5, so that's the version of router that I have. And then when we go over here, 12/1/23 is the end of support notification date. That's not super important, but look at this right here, 5/29/24. That's the end of support date. So that means after this date, TP-Link hasn't put out any firmware upgrades for this router. And at this point, that's about a year in the past. So at this point, my router is end of support. I really need to think about replacing it. Another really useful thing about this list is if I scroll to the top, even if you have a router that's not end of support, it will list the date in the future that it goes end of support. So you can really get ahead of planning when to replace your router, and you can do so in advance. So look at over here. A lot of these here, their end of support dates in 2026. So it's not end of support yet, but it gives you an idea that sometime in 2026, you might want to be looking at a new router. For everybody's reference, I'll include a link to this document in the description of this video. And I also found a similar page for Netgear. So if you have Netgear equipment, I'll include the link in the description down below so it's easy for you to access. So that's the main reason to replace your router if it's end of support. But there are other instances when you might want to look into replacing your router as well. For starters, if you're upgrading your internet plan and your current router can't support the bandwidth that your new internet plan will be providing, then you need to replace your router. This gives you an opportunity to buy a router that supports the speeds provided by your internet plan, and it ensures that your router doesn't serve as a bottleneck for your home network. If this is something you're planning to do, you can look up the make and model of your router, and somewhere in the technical specifications, it will tell you the speeds that it supports, and you just want to make sure it supports speeds faster than the internet plan you'll be upgrading to. Another case where you might want to replace your router is if you're moving to a bigger home with more square footage. Maybe you have a standalone modem and a standalone router, or you have a modem router combination device. But if you're moving to a significantly larger square footage, you might want to look into getting a mesh Wi-Fi system. This is something that I recently implemented in my home network, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever be going back to a standalone router after making the switch. And lastly, you'll need to replace your router if you want to take advantage of some of the newer Wi-Fi features that have been developed. Wi-Fi 6E has recently come out, Wi-Fi 7 has come out. So if you want to be able to take advantage of those new features, you need to get a router that's compatible with those Wi-Fi features. If you currently have a router that's Wi-Fi 4 compatible, or maybe even Wi-Fi 5 compatible, chances are it might be end of support, or it might be coming end of support shortly. So it might be a good opportunity to look at getting a router that is compatible with Wi-Fi 6E, or maybe even Wi-Fi 7, so you can take advantage of the latest and greatest Wi-Fi technology. I recently made a video detailing Wi-Fi 7, where I also provide a recommendation on if you should upgrade to Wi-Fi 7 or not. So this is something you'll want to check out if this is the scenario that you're currently in. A good rule of thumb is that you'll need to replace your router about every 5 years or so, but keep in mind that it could be a lot shorter time frame if your router goes end of support. I'd love to see in the comments section how old your router currently is, and I'd love to hear if this video helped you determine if your router is end of support or not. As always, thanks for checking out this episode from Network from Home, and we'll catch you on the next one.